Good morning, it's Wednesday, the 22nd of July. I'm Marit Gwyn and you're watching Europe Today, your morning dose of European news and analysis broadcast live here from Brussels. Coming up on today's show, the European Union is in a race against time to approve a new package of economic sanctions against Russia. But Greece has unexpectedly vetoed the proposals over a separate ban on Russian liquefied natural gas. We'll bring you more details on that story. And also, it's been a year now since the US and the EU sealed a trade deal designed to put an end to disputes and tensions. That deal imposed 15% tariffs on European goods, while the EU removed duties on most US industrial products. But 1 year on, US President Donald Trump is renewing tariff threats against allies and rivals alike. We'll have more analysis on that for you. And also, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has said that the war with Iran has cost the US $37.5 billion as strikes continued for the 11th consecutive night last night. President Trump has meanwhile vowed support to Lebanon in a meeting with the country's president in the White House yesterday. We'll have the latest for you from the Middle East. In other news, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has replaced Oleksandr Syrskyi with Mikhailo Drapatyu as Ukraine's commander-in-chief. It follows days of widespread protests in Ukraine and also pressure coming from civil society. But first, this morning, we're going straight to our top story because EU ambassadors are meeting today here in Brussels in a new attempt to strike a deal on fresh sanctions against Russia. But this entire package is being held up by one single country, and that's Greece. To explain more, Jorge Liboreiro, our correspondent, is here in the studio with us. Really good to have you this morning, Jorge. So, big story today in Brussels. Tell us first about Greece's demands here. Why are they blocking this package?
Yes, hello, Marit. Big story indeed. But to understand this story, let me take you back to October last year. So in October last year, member states, the 27, unanimously agreed to ban the import and transport of Russian LNG. This was hailed as, as a landmark decision, pressure on Russia, we're doing away with Russian LNG as of 2027. So as of January 2027, no more Russian LNG in the European market. Now, what's happening during the discussions of this new package of sanctions is that Greece has realized that the ban on transport is a problem for them. We need to remember that Greece is a coastal country which hosts the largest merchant fleet in the world. So maritime industry is really big in Greece. And Greece is saying that they need to continue the transport of Russian LNG because this provides market opportunities, sustains local jobs, and obviously brings a lot of money every month. So Greece is saying that the ban on transport needs to be revised and transport of Russian LNG needs to continue next year onwards.
And Jorge, we know that the Greek demands are closely linked to the industry, as you said, including Dynagas, which is a major shipping company. It's owned by a Greek billionaire, George Prokopiou. And it's worth saying that he is also linked to another company that actually transports Russian oil. So what does Dynagas say here about the LNG ban?
So indeed, Dynagas controls the market of LNG, but also transport of Russian oil. So we need to keep that in mind. But when it comes to LNG, Dynagas provides very specialized tankers that go into Siberia. Because in Siberia, we have the Yamal facility, which is Russia's largest and mainly provides European clients with LNG, but also clients worldwide. And Dynagas has chartered 11 vessels to Yamal in Siberia. So these vessels are, as I said, highly specialized. They break the ice, they sustain sub-zero temperatures, so very complex conditions there. So what Dynagas is saying that if we stop the transport of Russian LNG, this would be a self-inflicted blow to Europe's maritime capacity. This is a literal quote from a statement that the company sent last week. The company also said that the ban will fail to achieve its geopolitical objectives, meaning the crippling Russia's war machine. And the company, very notably, has raised the prospect of defaulting on its debt agreements if this ban on transport takes place. And we can now see the quote indeed sent by the company last week, which, by the way, these arguments that we see on camera closely align with the Greek government is now saying here in Brussels. Indeed. So we see a lot of synchrony between Dinagas and Athens.
And Jorge, we know then that Greece, for now, is holding firm on its demands. What has been the reaction from other EU countries?
Look, how could I put this kindly? Well, I'm not going to put it kindly. I'm just going to say that there's a lot of frustration, even fury with Greece, because I need to really stress this. Greece is trying to revise a ban that was unanimously agreed last year and became EU law. This is EU law. It's not part of the new package of sanctions that it's on the table. It's already EU law. And Greece now wants to retroactively challenge the content of this legislation. So for all the member states, this is a massive problem because they fear that if we grant Greece's request, then there will be a dangerous precedent set. And, you know, all the member states will come up with similar requests. Oh, I want to revise this. I want to check this law, reopen this text. Give me this, give me that. So it could be a massive problem, cascade of requests.
And finally, Jorge, you know, we know there's also this price cap on Russian oil, which will be automatically revised up tomorrow, I believe, unless the EU actually agrees on this new package of sanctions. So I guess this Greek veto is also threatening that and could see Moscow even gain more revenues on its oil purchases.
Yes, indeed. All things are coming together. No, the Greek veto and this revision of the price cap that, as you said, will go up if we don't delay it, which is the intention, to delay it. But for the time being, it's still there. The revision will take place on Thursday. But what I can see is that if the Greek veto remains in place, proves insurmountable, you know, that Athens really holds its ground and doesn't allow this to pass unless it gets an exemption, I think the price cap on Russian oil could be delayed just to September. Okay. So then in September, after the summer break, we'll come back to this, the unfinished business, and try to have a deal and try to have Greece on board. But as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. The Greek veto is really powerful because this maritime industry is essential for the country. But at the same time, the other 26 member states do not want to grant this request because of the precedent that it could set. So we're in for a fight today with the ambassadors.
Okay, Jorge, well, we will keep an eye out on those talks happening today, of course, in Brussels. Thank you so much for that analysis and for bringing us up to speed there. Now we're moving on to the Middle East next. The US has continued to attack Iran for the 11th consecutive night as the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth revealed that the war has now cost the US $37.5 billion. Let's get the latest now from our correspondent Adel Halim, who is in Qatar for us. Good morning, Adel. Great to see you again. Also yesterday, President Trump met Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun at the White House. Tell us what came out of that meeting.
Good morning, Mara. This is the biggest diplomatic development we've seen in the Israel-Lebanon conflict in months. President Joseph Aoun came to Washington looking for U.S. support to stabilize Lebanon after months of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. The focus was the U.S.-backed ceasefire framework. Lebanon wants a full Israeli withdrawal from the south, more support for the Lebanese army, and for the Lebanese state, not Hezbollah, to control southern Lebanon. Now, President Trump says Washington remains committed to this process, and he also added that Lebanon has been a very mistreated country for a long period of time, and, quote, we're going to solve a lot of problems. Marit?
Okay, so big promises from the US president there. Meanwhile, Adel, I know you're following developments there across the region. What's the latest this morning?
That's right. The U.S. has now completed 11 consecutive nights of attacks on Iran, and there are few signs that this conflict is easing anytime soon. Perhaps the biggest development came overnight in Washington. President Trump says the U.S. has no interest in talks with Iran, and even though he insists Tehran is desperate to negotiate. At the same time, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told Congress that the war has already cost $37.5 billion and asked lawmakers to approve another $67 billion in funding for our campaign. The dialogue between him and Democratic senators was very testy during this exchange. And that request is likely to raise questions about how long Washington expects this conflict to continue. Meanwhile, Iran says it carried out new attacks on military sites in Bahrain and Kuwait, while both countries say they intercepted missiles and drones overnight. Now, also, the Iran-backed Houthis are also threatening commercial shipping in the Red Sea, and that's already adding to the concerns over in the Strait of Hormuz, where vessel traffic continues to fall. So while diplomacy is making some progress between Israel and Lebanon, the wider regional situation is definitely moving in the opposite direction. We're seeing more military action, increasing economic pressure, and there's no clear sign that the fighting between Washington and Tehran will slow down anytime soon. Marit?
Okay, Adel Halim in Qatar for us. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed this morning. Now, moving on. 1 year after the EU struck a controversial trade deal with the United States, imposing 15% tariffs on European goods under Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, what has been the impact on Europe's economy? Well, new data suggests the cost of those tariffs has been felt on both sides of the Atlantic. European companies have, of course, taken a hit, but so too, and to a significant extent, have American firms. For more on this, let's bring in our EU editor, Maria Tadeo, who's with me in the studio this morning.
Good to see you.
Listen, this deal was meant to draw a line under disputes, uncertainty, tensions. Can we say that it's done that?
Look, it's a difficult question to answer, and also just how time flies. Because it was this time last year that Ursula von der Leyen got on a plane. She landed in Scotland, went to President Trump's golf complex in the country, and agreed to these new terms. And in a way, I find it difficult to call it a trade deal because we know it was not a negotiation. You've spoken to European officials. I've spoken to European officials, many of which will tell you privately, even though the Commission and the EU still defends the deal, they'll say it really wasn't a negotiation. Ultimately, there was a binary choice that the Europeans had to face, confront, and ultimately decide. One was, should we enter this trade war with the US? Of course, this is a big market. The EU does have trade power behind it, and they could enter a tit for tat the same way that China did, ultimately, or just take this 15% tariff, which is not a trivial thing. Tariffs tripled on European companies going into the U.S. market. Remember, before Liberation Day, you were looking at around 5%. That was certainly the average. But again, the choice that Europeans faced was enter this trade war, ultimately accept the 15%, but also setting up this precedent in which it can never go above 15%. Obviously, that had a hit for European companies. We've spoken about some of the extra difficulties that they faced. But when you look at the data, and this is very striking, the turnover in terms of trade between the U.S. and the European Union actually increased in 2025 to hit 1.8 trillion euros. The number, of course, is enormous, and it really reflects just the magnitude of this bilateral relationship. One thing that I would say, given, again, who is footing the bill, that's ultimately the question, is numbers may have gone up because companies were really rushing to get a lot of their stuff across the Atlantic before the tariffs kicked in. So 2026 should give us a complete picture. But to go back to your question, I think ultimately at this point, yes, tariffs tripled on European companies. The exemptions that the Europeans were hoping to get on real staple products like cheese, milk, pasta is about 115 euros that they're looking to get in exemptions did not manifest. So obviously that means prices have to go up. But what is interesting is European officials tell us a year later, it's actually the U.S. importers that have paid the most in this tariffs. Before the Liberation Day tariffs came in, it was at around 8 billion euros, the duty cost. Now it's standing at over 31 billion. So you're looking at almost 4 times the amount that they were paying. So yes, it hits both sides, but also you see that the Americans have also taken a hit, and it's American companies that ultimately also pay for this.
And Maria, we know that there's still 50% tariff, for example, on steel and aluminium. And the US continuing to link this to some regulatory movements on the EU side.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's a number of issues, of course, that came along with the 15%. The Europeans insisted that they wanted to see steel and aluminum go down for 50%. One thing to keep in mind for our viewers is once you go above that 50, it's a huge number, basically it becomes impossible to sell anything because it is just too expensive. So the Europeans have been asking for relief on that front, and they've also been asking for a quota for duty-free, essentially, to go bigger, to become incremental. That has not happened, and it is crucial for the Europeans to ease some of those tariffs. The Europeans also insist, and this is the case that they make before the U.S. administration, that this is about really together tackling China. They argue the issue, especially when it comes to steel overcapacity, is the Chinese, it's not the Europeans, so they should work together. The problem that they face is, A, the administration has not moved an inch on those two items. This is part of the Make America Great Again agenda to bring in those industrial jobs into the U.S. This is what the president of the U.S. wants to see, manufacturing jobs back in the United States of America. And then 3, as you say, the administration, in a way that is cunning, but it's also ruthless, and at times, frankly, it seems to work, is to say, if you want any form of relief, then you need to also give us regulatory relief. The issue for the Europeans is that this has nothing to do with tariff rates. It really is about politics, it's about sovereignty, and it's also how you interpret and apply the law of the land. And of course, Marit, we could see another flashpoint because, as you know, speculation is rampant in the city, that we could see a fine announced maybe even this week on Google around 1 billion. That could certainly escalate tensions between the two of them.
Indeed. And meanwhile, also this week, we are in fact hearing reports, at least, that Donald Trump, the US president, is thinking at least of unleashing more tariffs. Canada already in the line of fire. Are the Europeans worried about this?
Well, certainly, because this is part of a bigger strategy. The 15% tariff, and just really taking that hit to a relationship that basically, when you looked at the numbers before the tariffs came into being last year, it was pretty broad, right? And it was balanced between the Europeans. They accepted this in exchange for a form of relief. They always argued, look, it wasn't just trade. There were a lot of things on the table. The geopolitics were also there. And this was a way of, quote unquote, paying for insurance. The issue that we see is that the U.S. has a strategy that is clearly bait and switch. They will turn them on and off depending on the kind of concessions that they want from allies. From the Canadians have been complaining that they do not buy enough U.S. products, that their relationship is tilted in favor of Canada, and now they've been hit with 50% tariffs. At that point, that is prohibitive. This is a real political crisis now for the Canadian Prime Minister. When it comes to the Europeans, as you say, the administration said it overnight yesterday. Yes, expect action coming in the tariff front because they've had to tweak some of the construction, the structure of the tariffs, because some of them were struck down by the U.S. Constitutional Court. So they now expect to put forward new tariffs using different sections that could see more products and also the Europeans hit by it. I think one of the things that the Europeans know, and they know this very well, is that ultimately this is going to be a constant with the Trump administration. What you can do is hope for the best, but also say we have a capacity and an ability to retaliate. We talked about the anti-coercion instrument. That is certainly on the table that the Europeans can use. The question is, are they ready to use it, given that they did not want to fight a trade war last year, but also, Marit, the focus for the Europeans now is China. Indeed. Do you want to take on two big blocks?
And very, very briefly, Maria, on China, we are expecting by October some movement.
Massive deadline, yes. Look, it's a deadline October by the Europeans. They want to see the trade relationship become more balanced. There's been a massive trade deficit with the Chinese. The trade surplus from the Chinese to the world is now $1 trillion. That is unsustainable. And mathematically, it simply cannot continue. At some point, it would be too tilted in favor of China. The Europeans, however, they've set out this deadline, but it's a difficult deadline because if there's no rebalancing and there's no action from the Chinese and they take no action, they will look weak. If they decide to put forward measures to protect industries in Europe, well, the Chinese, you best believe, will retaliate. So indeed, both ways, you're looking at a difficult fall.
We are indeed. Thank you so much, Maria, for that analysis for us 1 year on after that trade deal was struck between the US and the EU. But that brings our programme for today to an end. Thank you so much for your company this morning. Remember, we also love to hear from you. You can send us comments, feedback or tips. Our email address is europetoday@euronews.com. In the meantime, see you soon here on Euronews and take care.